see so many people in the theatre at midday on a Saturday, not a regular time for maybe experiencing cinema. But then I've always thought it was very strange that our cinema habits mean that we get most of our cinema education just before we go to bed, which doesn't sound to me very, very encouraging. As though cinema was some sort of bromide or a cup of cocoa to lull you to sleep. And I would like to posit the idea that cinema is anything but a definition that I just described. Okay, self-evidently, as been introduced, at the top of my, I suppose, imaginative position at this moment would certainly be this huge product called the Tulse Luper Suitcases. And it might be an idea, perhaps, I want to turn this off so I don't distract you, so you look at me and you don't look at me. To maybe sort of initiate a conversation, or primarily, first of all, a monologue and then hopefully a dialogue, by suggesting some of the reasons of why this project ever took off in the first place. I suppose in maybe the early 1990s, I became extremely disenchanted with ideas of the cinema that we have arrived at. I would be a great admirer of all those apologists of the early part of the 20th century who would have imagined that cinema would be an extraordinary medium for extremely sophisticated dialogue. Who certainly, and I probably would imagine that most of those apologists would have been French, people like Bazin, for example, who would have really posited for the cinema a communication vehicle which would be as sophisticated as all the other known art media forms. You know and I know that obviously cinema cannot probably exist entirely as a rarefied intellectual conversation piece, and that necessarily to balance, I suppose, all the desires for pursuing the medium, there necessarily has to be Hollywood and Bollywood, and it's also a huge money-making investment proposition. Often based, I think, quite erroneously on the idea that cinema per se is an expensive, huge industrial process. I don't think it has to be expensive, and it doesn't necessarily have to be such a huge community activity. I would actually argue, and I suspect you probably agree with me, that if we were to play the journalistic game of making a list of I suppose, the most 1,000 worthwhile films in a cinema history of 110 years, I bet you they would all have cost less than $500,000. I don't think there's any particular value. I mean, we could play this sort of game. What really expensive films involving huge communities have been really successfully worthwhile. The potentiality, I suppose, also after 110 years would suggest that maybe the ways that we now look at cinema have, I suppose, overweigh the excesses of its notions of being an art form. But curiously, on the agenda is the idea that many, many more people would be apologists for this notion of being a very sophisticated communication vehicle, but often there's precious little actual physical evidence that that is really maybe the top of the agenda. I don't know, again, how many people in the audience. There must be, what, 250 people? Everybody probably has a different idea of what they think their cinema is about. And it's absolutely important to remain liberal and pluralistic. We presumably need as many different types of cinema as we could imagine. But there again, I think a rather sad thing has happened. Certainly in my formative days of filmmaking, I'm almost, I suppose, on parallel with the Nouvelle Vague and that great period of middle Italian post-neorealism. There were huge numbers of filmmakers, mainly in Europe, pursuing all sorts of different language possibilities. And now I think basically we have ended up basically with a worldwide cinematic monoculture. Basically all the films in the world are all modeled on a narrative, illusionistic, mimetic representation which is associated, I suppose, with the Hollywood ideal. So Californian films are now made in Beijing, Melbourne, Paris, London, Sheffield, certainly all over the world. There's become a sort of a greyness, a breaking down of differences, a less of alternative propositions. I think that's endemic of many things, but I will maybe pursue those particular ideas, first of all, with, I suppose, some provocations. And I suppose provocation number one is, I think cinema is dead. Now, this is one of those deliberate sort of journalistic propositions which immediately creates panic and mayhem, and also a sense of déjà vu. Haven't people said the theatre is dead? Haven't people said that the novel is dead? Well, indeed they might, but I think that the circumstances for making a claim that cinema are dead are somewhat particular. Cinema is a very sophisticated technology. You all know how it works. You're all sitting in a piece of architecture now called cinema. You're all sitting in the dark. What the hell are you doing sitting in the dark? Man's not a nocturnal animal. You're all looking in one direction. Goddard famously said, the world is all around you, not just in front of you. How artificial can you get? And if you are going to concentrate, I suppose, on the major form of cinematic experience, which is the feature film, it lasts about 2 hours, you're all being obliged to sit still for 2 hours, looking in one direction in the dark. Absurdist set of rules we've all practiced and are continuing to practice. Those sorts of games, of course, have been long established, the games that directors and producers play with audiences, but artificially, obviously quite profound, notions of your, I suppose, pacific enjoyment or appreciation of what happens on this parallelogram, this right-angled phenomenon, incredibly artificial behind my head. And if I make the proposition that I believe cinema is dead, I'll actually give you a date for that death. I will say it's the 31st of September, 1983, which is the day that's now generally recognized that the zapper or the remote control was introduced into the living rooms of the world. Bang, almost at one fell swoop, there is a way that the notions of interactivity begin to enter the agenda. And because you're sitting in the dark, and because you're looking in one direction, and because you're sitting still, how can you be interactive with that screen? Already, in a sense, the general characteristics of passive cinematic enjoyment, fascination, intrigue, have already curiously been broken. And though you might not particularly like it anymore, or you might think it's particularly boring and a journalistic trope, I think essentially the two big ideas that now govern our understanding maybe of cultural pursuits at whatever level are probably the two phenomena of interactivity and multimedia, and cinema can't deal with either of those propositions, at least not in the context of the piece of architecture and the circumstances of the economic arrangements that you and I are now sharing inside this space.